So, hi guys. Today we are going to be talking about weighing. What matters in each debate? Because that's basically what weighing is. First, a brief overview in terms of what we're talking about. What is weighing? How do you weigh impacts? How do you weigh analysis? And then what are the differences in top half versus back half? With fun and exciting activities interspersed, as you saw in my previous slide. Cool. So what is weighing? I think that weighing is primarily just an explanation for why something matters more. Not necessarily matters more than something else, but just why it matters more in general. It's not an explanation for why something else is unproven. And I think that this is a fairly common error that people make whenever they start to do weighing. The idea of weighing is taking other people's cases at their best or at close to their best. This is not your rebuttal section where you're like, and also they're wrong. This is your section for like, what happens if your rebuttal doesn't work? What happens if the judges just believe their case to a higher degree than you do? Or what happens if like they do some clever rebuilding and it turns out your rebuttal is entirely ineffective? What happens then, and what are judges supposed to say about your case in reference to their case? This is also particularly helpful whenever we're talking about across benches, right? Because opening government doesn't get very much of a chance to respond to closing opposition. So probably the things that are more important to do is not meticulous breakdown of each line by line that they could possibly have said wrong, especially whenever you're doing POIs, which we'll talk about later. And maybe it's more important to just explain why the thing that you're arguing for matters, or why it matters more than anything else. That's basically what weighing is. Whenever people are talking about weighing, they're talking about like how much weight should we give to a thing, how much importance or value should we place on a particular argument, and why should we do that? Because that's what weighing is fundamentally. Okay. Bringing us then to a few different ways to weigh impacts. So I've split this into two different sections. I've split it into weighing impacts and weighing analysis, because I think there's two types of weighing that you might do in any different kind of debate. There is, we've proven a thing and you have also proven a thing. Here's why our thing matters. And then there's like, we're an extension off of a clever team. However, we're going to try and weigh over them by being like, you guys analyzed your thing badly and we did not. So despite the fact that your impact matters more, it doesn't matter because you didn't prove it. I think that these things being split is probably important for you to think about, just because like they're very different ways to approach weighing. So we're starting with weighing impacts. A few different ways that you can weigh impacts are here. I think the easiest ones and the simplest ones, and the ones you'll be reaching for most often, are these. This is weighing on scale. We affect more people than you do, and therefore our impacts are more important. This is weighing on intensity. Perhaps we affect fewer people, but the degree to which we impact them is so much more that it matters quite a lot, right? Like, this is the difference between like, we may kill 3 people and you may give 100 people a paper cut, but probably killing someone is far worse than giving them a paper cut. So you probably ought to prioritize killing them over giving them a paper cut. The next one is frequency, which is how often this impact occurs. I actually think this one's underrated. I put it in the bread and butter section because I think it should be one of the very common ones you reach for, but it's not a very common one that people reach for necessarily. And the way that frequency works is how often this impact occurs. So you can have impacts that are not just a one-off, this changes once thing, but is actually a thing that you think about all the time. So this is a way to try and magnify a relatively small impact. So if you're talking about maybe the way that you think about yourself and whether you think about yourself positively or negatively, maybe this is a fairly low intensity impact. Maybe this doesn't even impact that many people, but for the people who are affected by your arguments, they think about this all the time. Every time they're considering themselves in relation to another person, every time they look in the mirror, or every time they wake up in the morning, this is a thing that happens to them literally all the time. And so it's a very frequent impact, even though it's not very high intensity or even necessarily very high frequency, applies to a lot of people, which means that for the people this applies to, this is maybe the most important thing in the world because it just happens so often that it ends up being really impactful. And then the last one that I think is really easy and really important to reach for is likelihood. This one's a bit of a meta question in terms of whether or not it's going to get bought. Once you start going onto the world stage, it's like some judges love it, some circuits hate it. Americans don't seem to care whether or not something is likely to happen. They just care that it's big, and that it's a big deal. Whereas Europeans tend to be much more likelihood matters. I think likelihood is particularly important for Eastern European judges who are like, if this thing is unlikely, I do not care how impactful it is. If I think it only happens even 30% of the time, why do I care about that? So I think that this one's a little bit more vulnerable to different circuit interpretations, but it is still an important thing. How likely is it that your impact is going to happen? Because maybe you have really high intensity, but low likelihood, and you probably should figure out a way to insulate against this. Why does it not matter that your impact is low likelihood? Or maybe you have extremely high likelihood of your impact manifesting, and then you should probably be weaponizing that. Then we get to a little bit more complicated methods. So these are not actually that much more complicated, but I think they're not necessarily ones that are applicable to every debate or even most debates that you're engaging in. This is stuff like urgency. This is like the way to weigh out in a climate change debate, right? If we don't do this now, we're never going to be able to solve it ever, which means we must solve it right now. And this is the only thing for you to care about. I saw a clever way of using urgency recently, actually, in the Oxford Novice Final, which was that the argument, the motion was like, you have had a deep and extremely valuable relationship with this person from the time you were 11 until you were 19. When you were 19, they died. This House, as this person, would prefer to have never met this person they had a meaningful relationship with. And closing opposition was like, it's important to recognize the value of people and to engage in like a really honest way in your relationships in your day-to-day life, and to like spend time with people and value the time that you're spending with people. And the way they used urgency here was they said, it's really important that this tragic loss happens to you when you're young, because if it doesn't happen to you when you're young, every year that this has not yet happened to you is another year that you waste engaging in relationships worse, and that's time you can never get back. So that means it's extremely, extremely valuable to do this as quickly as possible, or to have this happen to you as early as possible. So maybe you'll get over the harm of having lost this meaningful and deep relationship if you forget them, but that doesn't really help you very much, because even if you have another death later on that teaches you the same lesson, you've lost all of this time. Which then sort of brings me to permanence, which is the idea of this: if this impact happens, it can never be reversed. And this can be both a good and a bad thing, right? Like if your impact is we stop climate change and no one else can start it ever again, that's a great impact, and you probably want to weigh that, because that matters a lot. If your impact is if we do this, we cause the world to be destroyed and we can never ever get another world, that's probably a bad thing. Or maybe that's the impact that the other team is making, right? Like they may have lots of positive impacts, but one of their impacts is the thing they can't reverse. And there's a lot of, like, I think, fun ways to interact with the fact that reversibility is probably a good thing, because we don't actually know the nuances of how this will play out into the long term. We don't actually know the nuances of whether or not this will be a valuable thing 100 years in the future. So permanence is probably an interesting one to think about. And then you have resilience. This is like, I've written the example for likelihood here because I moved things around. Pretend that example is not put in, and I'll fix that in the slides later. But resilience is, I think, also a way to do analysis, and to weigh your analysis against someone else's. But it is also a way to do impacts, which is the way that you would do it in analysis is people can respond to this in a lot of different ways. However, regardless of the way that they respond, we still get some degree of our impact. Whereas our opening, if they respond accurately to our opening, then their impact just doesn't happen at all. In the impacts world, and the way that you do resilience here, it's more along the lines of like, this impact probably happens. This impact probably happens regardless of what people attempt to do to stop it. And this impact, therefore, is fairly resilient to even other narratives that may exist, to even other like things that exist in the world that might be able to mitigate some of the impact. The impact itself still stays and still applies, regardless. So I think the easiest way to think about it is thinking about resilience in that frame of like an argument that's resilient to rebuttal. It's the same thing. It's an impact that's resilient to other things that happen in the world, or other ways that people might try and deal with a particular problem. And then we have long-term versus short-term weighing, which is just a question of like, what do we prioritize? Why? You can weigh long-term versus short-term in either direction. You can say that it's more important to make arguments that or to have an impact that's really long-term because there are more people in the future than there are in the short term, right? Like this is a classic way to weigh. Or you can say it's more important to do things in the short term because the long term is really speculative. We don't actually know what's going to happen in 100 years. Who knows? Who cares? But I think that you can weigh out long-term and short-term in a lot of different ways. It's just a way to think about it. More methods. These are the ones that are more tricky and also very, very argument and motion dependent. Now you have things like responsibility. Maybe there's a particular actor who has a greater responsibility to deal with a particular thing than anyone else. The most common way for this to apply is the state. Whenever you have an argument that's like a criminal has committed a crime and therefore like someone should deal with this crime, the easiest way to weigh why it matters most for the state to intervene is because the state's the only one who can, the state's the one who failed in the first place and were the reason the crime was allowed to be committed, and the state's the one who has claimed that it is their responsibility to prevent, mitigate, and deal with crime, which means that they have the responsibility to do it, so therefore we should prioritize them doing the thing they said they were going to do. The other example here that I've written on the slide, which is maybe the more intuitive one, but the one less likely to come up in debate because it's a silly one, which is just that if a mother sees a stranger's child drowning and her own child drowning, we would probably say she has more of a responsibility to save her own child than she does to the stranger's child. She should probably save both, but if she has to pick one, we'd probably say it's bad if she doesn't pick her own kid. Then we have opt-in and opt-out. So this is just like, yeah, your impact may be really bad and really, really impactful, but the problem is the people who you're talking about knew that there was a chance this could happen. The people I'm talking about didn't know there was a chance this could happen. They weren't involved in it and they didn't care. So the example I've given here is the stock market. The imaginary motion I have in my head is that opening argues that the stock market is going to crash and this is going to be bad because people who've invested in the stock market are going to lose their pensions or going to lose a substantial amount of money. Closing is arguing that the stock market crashing is bad because it impacts the economy as a whole. It means that prices become substantially worse. It means that you're less able to buy things, wages, a lot of people get laid off of work, et cetera, et cetera. The way that you would probably weigh this from closing is being like, look, yes, the stock market crashing is bad. Both of us agree about this. But buyers in the stock market knew the risk. They put their money into the stock market as opposed to like a bank or like buying some kind of long-term bond because they accepted that there could be some fluctuations, which means that they've basically opted into this risk. It sucks for them, but they chose to accept the risk whenever they took this action, which means that we ought to prioritize the people who didn't necessarily choose this. So the people who are engaging in the general economy as a whole, who maybe didn't have an option not to engage in the general economy because the economy is a thing you have to engage in. The people who are going to perhaps lose their jobs matter more than the pensioners who chose to put their pension in the stock market. I think that this is a way to just think about responsibility in a different way, in a different frame, because responsibility can either be the person who's doing the action or the person who's receiving the action. Maybe they have a responsibility for this. It's a weird one to argue, I think, because it can sort of get into like, in another world, this would be a victim blaming argument. However, it is a fun way to weigh, and it is a useful way to weigh because people don't often preempt against it. They don't talk about why these people should not, like, they just say people shouldn't suffer a harm because it's bad for people to suffer a harm. They don't really do the comparative work to explain maybe people shouldn't suffer a harm, but also they shouldn't be in a situation to suffer that harm in the first place. The next one is vulnerability, which is just like, a group has been historically failed. Therefore, we ought to care about the fact that this group has been historically failed, and we ought to prioritize not failing them again. It's like a karmatic justice kind of idea, which is like, perhaps if particular groups of minorities have been failed systemically and repeatedly and historically, we ought to prioritize those groups of minorities not being failed again because they've already gotten like a negative 100, and everyone else who has like a +5 or +7 can take a -3 without it being that big of a deal. But it's much worse to like keep knocking someone who's already down. The last one's just a general principled weighing, which is the idea that this is sort of a metric justification, which is in a debate where you know that there are probably both practical and principled arguments, right? So a debate where you know that people can argue about the things that you expect them to argue about in terms of people feel bad and that sucks. But you also know that there are some arguments that exist that are maybe more about like what things ought to be about. So an example here is most crime and justice debates have this exact trade-off happening or have this exact conversation happening. So I'm not sure, I think we set this for a debate here. Don't remember if it was the show debate during the judging workshop or what it was. But it was also a Cambridge AV motion, which is just prosecutors, should they be elected or should they be appointed? whenever you're talking about prosecutors and what the law is going to do, there's going to be a lot of questions on utility in terms of like what happens to the people who are victims of crimes, what happens to people who are perpetrate crime or accused of perpetrating crime. These are the practical considerations. But there are also other considerations. What is the law for? Why do we do justice in the first place? What is justice, and does justice matter? These kinds of considerations can also then be brought into the debate and sometimes weighed above other practical considerations, because maybe a back half team might stand up and go, look, some people are going to get off whenever they shouldn't get off. Some people are going to be punished when they shouldn't be punished. Honestly, there's not much of a difference on those things in this debate. What actually matters is whether or not we're fulfilling the purpose of democracy. And I think that that's a fairly reasonable opposition claim that comes out of the prosecutor's motion, because opposition's defending prosecutors that are elected. And they're like, we have a democratic system, we ought to maximize democracy, we ought to maximize representation. Here is a court system that has quite a lot of control over people's lives, so people should have control over what happens within that court system. This is whenever, from top hat or from honestly opening government, you probably should be doing some degree of resiliency against this. You don't want to deal with closing opposition saying, actually, we should be talking about the electorate. Like, this is a crazy thing. It's distracting, annoying, and you don't have enough time to respond to it in a POI because it just is, it's too complicated to respond to. So this is whenever you give more of an internal justification for why utility is the thing you should weigh the debate on. Or alternatively, if you're going to be opening opposition and you've had a practical clash on top half, which is nice for you, but you know back half could try and turn this into a utilitarian debate, you can be like, look, utility doesn't make any sense. Here's why. We're going to instead judge this debate on some other moral framework that matters more. I don't know why I did that. There we go. We're going to instead judge the debate on some other moral framework that matters more. So that's like whenever you can give perhaps the thought experiment about when humans are willing to sacrifice utility because they just think other things matter more. So like there's a thought experiment where there's a village that is perfectly happy and completely at peace and everything goes well. But the reason that this village is able to be perfectly happy is because there's a child in a dungeon that's being tortured 24/7. And everyone, I think, probably is like, that's a bad village. We shouldn't have that village around. I wouldn't want to live in that village. I don't think it's a good thing for people to choose to live in that village. Like maybe it's morally bad for you to agree to live in that village knowing that the only reason you're happy is because a child's being tortured. I think that that's one of the places where utility fails. And that's when you can be like, because of that intuition, what that intuition means is that there are cases in which we are willing to sacrifice utility because net utility in the village is fine, everyone's happy, and the amount of, you can always like numerically do it, so you're like, and the amount of happiness is more than the amount of suffering that the child is facing, but at the same time, we still think that's bad. Yeah, Leonda?
There's also the organ harvesting, which is like, even if you could pick 5 organs out of a healthy person's body to save 5 dying people, you wouldn't do it because that's violence. So utility doesn't matter. There's a bunch of fun for it.
Yeah, there's that's a fantastic one, because I also think that one's extremely intuitive, and it's a little bit faster in terms of like if someone walks into a hospital, we wouldn't say that we should be allowed to pin them down and cut out their organs, even though it means 8 people are going to live, because we just think someone has a right to their organs, maybe, and also that we shouldn't kill people for no particular reason other than other people living. And then you start to break down, why do we think that? Why do we believe that? And once you've given that explanation for why, that's the weighing that we're talking about in terms of utility doesn't make any sense. And then you can be like, and here's a moral framework that makes more sense, that's able to be somewhat more resilient. I think that's the more complicated, I think that's one of the most complicated weighing metrics. And I think there are very few cases in which a full defense of this is necessary or useful or resilient even, because I think even whenever you explain why utility makes no sense from opening government, back half can be like, actually utility is the only way we ought to live, and then give a comparative resilient justification because they've heard all of your reasons for it. So now they get to respond to those reasons. But I think that sometimes this is a thing that should be considered, particularly when you have a debate that has both moral and utile trade-offs. And that's when you should probably be thinking about those things. Okay. But what do you do with these metrics, right? Because like you have the metric and you say the metric, but I'm sure you've been in a debate before where you've been like, and we affect more people, therefore we win. And the judge is like, No, you don't. Like how do you make this work a little bit better? Because I think that's the next step. Now you know how you ought to be weighing or what metrics you ought to be using for your impacts, but like, what are you doing? I think that this is whenever you explain why this is a thing that ought to matter in the first place. And I think that this is whenever you start to look at like, why do we value these things? These are things that we intuitively value, which is why I've put them on a nice little list and a nice little set of slides for you. But what matters about them? There's something there or something that matters. So we're going to do a fun little exercise. We're going to talk to a person next to you. We don't need like major groups here, but we're going to talk to a person next to you. One team has made a high scale, low intensity argument. The other team has made a high intensity, low scale argument. That's all you get to know about this. Talk to your partner and come up with a reason why you might care about scale or a reason why you might care about intensity. You get like 2 minutes.
Why we care about scale or why we care about stats. Everyone who is impacted has done it was it's like very different as here when I got more attention because it has so much the 0 to 10 would be whereas there's kind of activation those small harms because everyone shares just as many we should learn the adjustment itself as well. There's some people
Okay, let's come back and raise your hand if your group talked about scale mattering more than intensity. Okay, raise your hand if your group talked about intensity mattering more than scale. Okay, good balance, appreciate it. Max, why does intensity matter more than scale?
So the way we would think of it was if you have low intensity and high scale, that means like all the people affected will perhaps feel like a very marginal difference in sort of intensity, but we think that there's like a certain degree of intensity to which you're not going to feel any substantial difference. Like Table uses the phrase activation energy. I agree, but unnecessarily complicated. But it's just like intensity has no effect, like on a subjective basis, past like below a certain threshold.
Cool. Remind me again, Colton, you talked about scale over intensity, right? And do you guys want to explain why you did that?
Well, it was mostly
So I will try not to rebut the previous argument. The basic idea was that we said that when you have something that is high scale, given that it affects a large number of people who naturally interact with other people very frequently, high scale things are very likely to have positive spillover and things like that. If it's a bad thing, then it's likely to draw the necessary attention to resolve problems quicker. But like there is positive spillover to high scale benefits when they occur. Essentially.
Does anyone have another reason they had for either direction, Tristan?
So I was, I communicate by people here who both disagreed with me. There's like a fun philosophical hypothetical, about like the utility monster, and I'm probably gonna completely botch this, but I think the general idea is that like, if you like have a person in which like all utility is concentrated, so you have more cumulative utility, but you pull it all into one person, would we hypothetically want to do that rather than distributing it more like having less utility but distributing it among the masses? And the idea is that this seems somewhat unintuitive, right? Like we probably wouldn't want to just make one person maximally happy at the extent of like, even if their like feeling was so profound that it superseded everybody else's.
Yeah, so that's an argument for scale over intensity, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Does anyone have another reason they had for either direction? Did anyone talk about getting used to something? Yeah?
Yeah, I was just like, cool guys, let that happen. It's like obviously very flippant and it depends what the intense thing is. But like in a lot of circumstances, the intense impact is actually something you can get used to really quickly. Like it's a really short-lived intense impact which you can recover from quite quickly, or you just like build up natural like emotional immunity to that thing. So you just learn to cope. Whereas there's lots of people who are harmed, and lots of people won't be able to access that coping mechanisms to deal with that, which is probably worse.
Yeah, there's yeah, so there's also another way to do it in the other direction, which is that if your difference is not actually that different from your baseline, this is almost like the activation energy idea, but it's that you just become more accustomed to it over time. So like you only can reconcile your life in comparison to what you yourself have experienced. If it's not that different from what other things you've experienced, you start to forget the other things you've experienced in the past. We're done.
You could on scale, you could like why scale over intensity. You could probably also argue that what people experience is ultimately subjective and unknowable, and so opposition might be saying it's going to be incredibly high intensity, but combined with the other mechanisms that Zainab, Tamar, and you provided, this just means that we should resort to either people avoiding the most amount of people avoiding injustice, as in that is the only calculable measure. So if more people on our side is going to have, say, consent violated, that's probably more of a harm because it is a clear injustice we can point to, rather than a utile harm because people might subjectively experience it differently. So it's a different way of thinking about what harms end up occurring.
Yeah, and that's like actually very intuitive to me once it's been explained, right? Like I think that it is probably just true that the pain I experienced for the same thing is probably different than the pain that Rodon experiences for the same thing. So like maybe there's something to be done there. Yeah.
Your fairness argument that like scale is more important because it's more fair if everyone gets like a share. I guess this is maybe more for positive impacts. Like it's more fair if everyone gets a share, even if it might make more of a difference to what they.
Yeah, I think that works perfectly. Interestingly, I think it works quite well folded in with Tristan's argument with the utility monster thing, where it's like one of the reasons that we think the utility monster is a little bit crazy. Because we think it's like also completely unfair that everyone else should be living like a -1 life if just one utility monster is living a plus 10,000 life. We think that's like weird and bad and probably also unfair. So I think you can fold that in there. This is your friendly reminder that the World's Manual does allow you to appeal to common intuitions. So you can just appeal to like general things that people believe about these things. It's probably better if you can then explain why people believe it, but just making the claim in the first place is your first step to justifying the weighing metric. Your second step is then explaining why people believe these things. Cool. Rapid fire, we're going to do fun things. We've got lots of things here. These are all different weighing metrics that someone might make an appeal to. They're all things that I've explained previously, so you should know exactly what they are. We're going to take like a minute to look at them and think about them, and then we'll rapid fire try and get a bunch of different comparisons and why one might matter more than the other. Pick two, compare them, figure out why one matters more.
Long-term impact or short-term impacts, because they're longer term.
The impact of more instances. Where people can't opt in because future people can't do that. And then like short term because they influence future fish basketball. They've started up long term. So what do we do? Any more?
Ben. Benjamin, what two did you choose to go? Like, which two would you like to compare? Ben, which two are you going to compare?
I'm going to.
Hold on. I can hear you motion balance testing the motions for the tournament I'm going this weekend. Okay. Okay, then make your comparison. Okay.
I can say that evidence is more important.
Mhm.
Because even if something is likely to happen, it might not be likely to stay around for long periods of time.
Mhm.
Considering you're already speculating on its existence in the first place,
Mhm.
it's more important to be sure that you can have some level of impact in any case, because then you're at least benefiting some people like in a tangible way, and you can point exactly towards how you benefit something.
Cool. Anna, which two would you like to compare?
I'll go with the frequency versus urgency.
Yeah, go for it. Which one matters more?
I would probably say
It's not a trick question. There's no wrong answer.
I would probably
Okay.
say that like over the course of your life, that's going to have a much bigger impact than something that's happening to you every day.
Mhm.
Whereas even if something is more urgent,
Mhm.
that's not necessarily something that you feel. You might feel because in the future.
Yeah, so it's just like it matters more that this is a thing you encounter more frequently, because even if it needs to happen tomorrow in order to prevent it, like it's maybe fine if it happens because it won't be as impactful once it does. Yeah, I think that's a very reasonable way to challenge the impact of someone's thing. Iona, do you have thoughts?
I'm quite compelled by long-term impacts, because I think it's quite easy to argue, or easier to argue sort of long-term societal change,
Mhm.
and therefore to scale into it and say that, you know, this is impacting a significant number of people because of that long-term change. And I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because yeah, exactly. Like the like super fast weighing I gave when Bray broke it down. It's just there are more people in the future, so therefore it causes more of an impact. But also the longer it takes for something to apply, it probably goes through more changes and more steps. People have thoughts, Max, and then we're done.
I have a question related to long-term impacts. I have like something that I've thought of before, and I would like your opinion on like
Mhm.
how legitimate of an argument it is. Like in a religion debate,
Mhm.
let's say you do something that goes against your religion.
Yeah.
And in your religion, if you do that thing, you will supposedly suffer in hell for all eternity.
Yes.
And like infinity weighs about
Yeah.
anything.
Yes.
Is that a valid argument?
Yes. It's a very common argument, in fact. It's well, I don't know if it's a very common argument everywhere. It's sure as fuck common in Scotland. And it's sort of hit a point in Scotland where part of the proof you have to give in a religion debate is why the religion is either real or not real, in order to prevent against this problem or weaponize it yourself. Rodon, you had thoughts?
How do you weigh likelihood of something? It's the permanence of something.
Didn't someone just do that?
No, they weigh why permanence is more important than likelihood.
Uh-huh.
How do you weigh likelihood against permanence the other way around?
So
So ops arguments are definitely going to occur, whereas your arguments only have a 70% chance, and that is the only difference between the arguments.
right. So that's not what permanence and likelihood are.
Okay.
Permanence is if this happens, it will be impossible to recover from. It will be impossible to revoke. So permanence is like the climate change. Once we pass the critical threshold, there's nothing that can be done. Climate change will definitely happen. Likelihood is we have a 90% versus 70%. So in a likelihood versus permanence argument, what's happening is you say, yes, if we cross the critical threshold, that will really suck. But you have a 1% chance of crossing the critical threshold. Let's be real here. Alex?
I think
kind of doing that also has a little bit to do with like almost the urgency, like the likelihood and urgency comparing to permanence are kind of similar in some ways.
Yeah.
So I think with permanence, you're gonna be like, yes, global warming, like if this happens, it will go on for a long time. But A, we're gonna find ways to adjust. This is just like how humans work.
Mhm.
And B, like I think that the impacts might like dilute in some way, even if the impacts still continue on for eternity. But if you compare this to urgency or likelihood, it's so much more likely that, say, the ozone layer is going to like deplete and we're all going to die. And this is why scientists focus on that as opposed to global warming. And this is the more urgent issue as well as the more likely issue. And I think that's kind of how you can compare both of those to permanence in the way that those.
Yeah, Justin?
On frequency versus intensity, making the case for like intensity over frequency.
Yeah.
This might turn out to be something of a dumb hypothetical, but if for instance you were presented with a choice to stub your toe on Lego like every week versus potentially like, I don't know, you get stabbed in an alley, but it's guaranteed to miss all your vital organs and you survive.
Yeah.
If you'd rather stub your toe on Lego every single week or get like stabbed, you would probably say that being stabbed would be worse than stubbing your toe on Lego every week.
Yes, it really is. Yeah, so I do think one of the vulnerabilities of all of this is any weighing metric appeals to someone's intuition, and you're always going to run into that one judge who's like, I don't buy that. Like I had a serious problem for about a year with this classic intuition to explain the utility thing, or it's to explain why autonomy matters to people. And so the intuition here is like, would you rather be someone who lives like an average life and like is able to make decisions in their life, has choices, lives a life, some good things happen, some bad things happen, and then they die? Or would you rather be like a really happy oyster? And there's nothing you can do. You just like hang out in the ocean and float, and you're a really happy oyster. But you don't get to do anything about it, and you don't get to like say anything about it, and you don't get to be remembered or have any connections or interactions to people. And the problem I kept running into is the judges who were judging me were university students who thought they were too cool for school, and they were like, I'd be an oyster. Even though I don't actually think that that's necessarily true, I do think people value making decisions and choices in their life, but you can't set it up in a way that allows them an answer that works in both ways. I think that's the huge vulnerability in general in weighing, because if the response is obvious, not only will your opposition give it, but your judge might give it for you, and that's a fucking disaster. Alex?
Is that not just like the same thing as like the thought experiment of would you rather be plugged into a machine that makes you?
Yeah, it's exactly the same thing. I just thought the oyster is more intuitive because it's like, why would I just want to hang out in the ocean all day and like do nothing, not really be able to feel anything, not be able to talk to anyone? Like, why would that be an important thing for me? But so many people were like, yeah, I'm so depressed, I'd rather be an oyster. So I think that gut checking your intuitions against your partner is also another way to avoid this vulnerability, because usually two people who speak together are at the very least a little bit different, even if they're very similar in intuition. And most of the time, there's a huge value to speaking with someone who is very different from you in intuition. So if you in prep can just gut check these intuitions and be like, would you rather be an oyster? At least then you'll maybe run into the person who's like, yeah, I would totally rather be an oyster. And you're like, all right, time to rethink. We're done?
Yeah, I would say I'm highlighting the importance of not just rehashing like thought experiments in philosophy. The experience machine one is the one that I see used a lot. And every time I'm judging, my first thought when everyone uses, do you want to be plugged into experience machine and pump full of heroin? I'm like, yeah, that sounds sick. like constructing the intuition in a way that like forces the judge to feel and not just saying, you really don't want to be like happy all your life, man. like that's what I think that rhetoric becomes quite important.
Even with the oyster thing, notice how many times I emphasize that you don't get to make connections. That's the thing I learned really hard. Like many times I learned this lesson in a bad way, but it turns out that really matters. People start to think about the relationships they have or don't have. I'll take one more question and then move on. Justin?
So on the hypothetical tonight, should really emphasize that like you're going to be in hospital for days, you're going to be in so much pain, so much excuse.
You just have to make stabbing your toe on a Lego not sound that bad. Like, I think you're just like, you like stub your toe a bit. Like, you have to make it sound silly and stupid and like it's not that big of a deal. Okay. we've got a good old-fashioned motion prep. If you have not been around for one of these, it's been almost an entire semester since we did them. So we're going to do it again. The way that a motion prep works is I'm going to group you guys into 4 different groups. There's a lot of you, but we'll still do 4 different groups. These groups will theoretically, if I can manage it in a rapid fire style, be fairly diverse in terms of your group, etc. One group will be opening government, one group will be opening opposition, one group will be closing government, one group will be closing opposition. You guys get 10 minutes to, or probably 8 minutes to write all your thoughts down on a document that I'll send to someone in that group. And at the end of 8 minutes, you have to stop writing, and we'll go through and run through how the debate would play out and what people might argue and what might happen. So, first, to make groups before our good old-fashioned motion prep. The problem is all of the first years are over there. This is a classic problem. I'm going to pause the recording for the moment. Alrighty, guys, we are going to come back and chat through everyone's ideas. So, we're going to start with opening government. So, opening government, do you want to talk us through what you have written?
So stuff like, probably just frame out a lot of like politics stuff, and that because of the CCP social media, a lot of it's going to be quite censored. So the debate's just going to occur on day-to-day practical qualities of life that people in China probably care about, whether it be financial advice we should invest into, medical advice, how you should treat illnesses, or just legal advice on how you should approach with wrongs of incurring. The first case is just spreading of misinformation and why influencers often spread large amounts of misinformation. So oftentimes these influencers think they know a lot because they've just been reading a bunch of things, or they maybe want to post stuff. They're oftentimes not showing nuance in topics, which means that even if they believe they know a lot, they're missing out things that people in the industry are aware about. They also go for algorithmically viable popular stuff, which means they can oftentimes spread a lot of advice, which without even believing they're spreading about a lot of advice. So they end up talking about these issues without even realizing they're committing a harm in the first place. So this looks like people profiting off of Charlie Kirk by being like, here's what's happening with Charlie Kirk, not really knowing general things about American politics. On the comparative, these people are going to spread good information. They have high levels of education, which also means they're getting paid quite well. So they're doing this out of goodwill. They have their reputation on the line and probably just care about like honor and people believing and trusting with them. But there's also just a diversity of these people, as in you can study in a variety of different things. You end up getting degrees in different things, and there's also a lot of people in China. So you still have a variety of different views that are espousing, and probably a competing different academic stuff. The weighing just ends up being that it's quite bad if people use bad advice here, like poor medical advice, poor legal advice. These things do have real consequences, even small stuff is.
This is cheating. You have to stop, guys.
We also have like misinformation spread, and it's hard to tell what's real or not because you bet where you get it from. So epistemics become harder. Misinformation will be worse than less information because misinformation causes you to act in bad ways. Whereas when you don't know, you often don't act, and so you can try and seek out information. Oftentimes you will go to social media, but this also makes it better. Bad levels of information also means you're far less likely to just trust other information that comes on social media. So if you've been harmed by this, it means you get good information later in the line. You're less likely to trust that person as a form of epistemic authority. Probably good to have things of epistemic authority in your life. And bad information also crowds out good information because of the incentives of of social media incentives that were listed above. So on upside, they may get some people who are probably quite qualified who can say stuff that qualified people can, but on the whole, we're willing to trade off some pieces of diverse good information to just get good mass scale information, which we just have good quality of life. We also have 2 more cases. The second one is that people who are relevant in the field become more popular on social media. If you scroll down, there's more stuff.
We're done.
You said OG prep. We didn't have enough time for the third case, but this also preempts where you just get less misinformation, but it also means that there's higher incentive for now if there's a gap in the market for your specific legality or your specific thing, you're more inclined to get on it, specifically because you know they get more views and they get more money from sponsors, but also there's an incentive from companies within those things also being able to make more content. This also leads to a cyclical cycle where people are then better able at communicating from specific professionalities down, which is quite good because academia can often be locked off and there's higher levels of space occurring, and just general things like social media are looked down upon because they're considered lesser forms of media. It's good for these experts to start making this content, believe they can make content, and think there's legitimate form of advice. There won't be bad information because
all that stuff, but perhaps it's good to have discourse occurring at a higher level. The impact in just academia gets more money, people from these spaces occurring. We also just think it promotes a general culture of education, that people are going to see people who see people who have degrees, people who are going to be able to interact with people who have more degrees more, and just able to get a better knowledge of what these degrees, companies, and stuff lives on. So you just get more information about these high level academic quality in sectors, which also just means there's more there's more democratic availability to what these like internal institutions end up looking like, because those people end up being available more. Didn't get time to writing it, but, you know, it's OG, so we get time to DPM as well.
Cool. Okay, opening opposition. Let's go over to y'all. What do you got?
That's all.
Right. So does anyone want to talk us through the case? Lauren, why don't you talk us through?
I think we talked about like the feasibility of regulation, like who is doing it. But then like looking back on it now, I think the Chinese government is really good at like regulating shit. Someone who has been in China and it's like spends a quarter of their time in China, like okay, but like the freedom of speech principle I think is something that's really important, because especially because like CCP censorship is like really rampant. This is just another way to like crack down on it. And I think like the appeal to authority is really specific to China, because people in China actually are really incredibly trusting of like authority, much more than like here. Here you might be like, doctors are like shit, you know, like med students are jack shit, but like no, they're like, oh my god, they went to med school, they're so good. Because I think because like getting an education in China specifically is so highly competitive that like someone who has gone and gotten a specialization in that particular field is someone who has worked hard to get to where they're at, and therefore that's why there's a long history of like just blind faith and trust in these people, even though the idea that they're good faith actors is not actually guaranteed, because they could have like other incentives, right? Because like again, that's social media, so like you get more, the more clicks you get, the more traffic you get, the more like revenue you get, especially if you're like a finance guy whose like stocks aren't doing very well, right? Like we talked about how like people are like, I didn't want you to buy into this fund, they want you to buy into that fund, like it's not really good. And like I think that kind of like went into the, and then bad influences skills, which like people who are like professionals like will not be really good at like making reels or like blah blah blah, or they won't have time for that. And like the thing is, we think that people from different backgrounds, like education level, having like things is like having their views like that out there is good, because I think like what Redan said about like, oh, China is a very large country, but China is a very large, very homogenous country, especially with the type of people who get into university in the first place. They're going to look a certain way, they're going to come from a certain background, right? Simply because of the environment that allows them to.
You just referred to your closing. They definitely all made faces and put their hands to the heads.
Put the one like super Chinese. Yeah, and then we were talking a lot about how like historically underrepresented people in these fields, like medicine has like such a huge like history of ignoring like women's issues or like fat people's issues, thinking that like, oh, if like you're a woman and you're sick, like, oh, it's just like you're hysterical, or like you're just making a mountain out of nothing, or like if you're fat, it's just because you're fat and like you need to exercise, but like no, it's because you've got an actual illness. And like these people, like social media is oftentimes the democratic way for them to like get their opinions and viewpoints out, because traditional media outlets are not going to give them the time of day over like qualified authorities. And like this motion just further hurts these people, because like now they're being censored on this platform as well, which was previously the only most possible avenue for them to have their opinions and have their experiences heard. And like basically you're taking away that one alternative to them. Yeah.
So, and then your weighing is on vulnerability and
And
responsibility.
then the responsibility as well.
Brilliant. Closing government, how are y'all extending on your opening? Can I, what? Can I pick someone? Charlie.
Okay, so I think we have two things that we want to say. First of all is like lots of people want to be influencers. And this kind of like validates that career path. It makes it seem more like a thing that can be done or should be done, or like a career path where you can go and make money and you have to get a degree to do it anyway. So it's kind of like valid, and like people's parents don't feel like look down on them when they decide they want to post on TikTok for a living.
That is particularly interesting because in the debate I actually watched on this motion, that's what closing opposition ran. Like in the other way, and that this makes it harder to be an influencer, and a lot of people want to be an influencer. But yeah, that's really interesting. Keep going.
Okay. Okay, and then we're also going to try and flip one of the things that OO said about like there's going to be less stuff online, and we think less reels online is good because then that's less brain rot, which is good. Yeah. And then like the actual one that we kind of did this was about like how like if this happens, then people will do Chinese media as like more legitimate and more verified, and like not just an entire thing of like propaganda. Like if you have to have like actual degrees in things, and people don't necessarily have to get degrees from Chinese universities, like or whatever. So it's not necessarily all propaganda now. Like it is, some of it is true. And then
I see that you guys wrote down the obvious case that your opening then, obviously took because it was the obvious case.
Yeah.
Did you guys talk through the burdens that exist in that obvious case? Because your opening did miss a fairly critical burden, even in their long explanation of it. Did anyone notice the burden that opening government missed? It's the idea that this is going to be done well. It's like one of the like extremely simple ones. That the kinds of misinformation they're going to pick are going to be the right kinds of misinformation to target, or even that this will target misinformation necessarily at all. I don't think there was a substantially strong defense in opening government of why people who are educated are good at this. They say that they have honor and reputation on the line and they're doing this out of goodwill. But I'm not sure that they prove that this is going to get rid of bad information necessarily, or that this is
speeches on this, or just
no, I think that covering burdens is part of emotion when I'm done. I do just think so. I think another way to think about extending that is probably helpful to do in motion preps, because then it's helpful to do in actual debates, is in terms of being very critical about what your opening is talking about or is not talking about, and what burdens you can cover. So there's a question that you guys can prove about why the Chinese state is a good actor, and there's a question that you guys can prove about why degrees are the thing that that's able to fix this happening, misinformation being spread in a bad way. So I think y'all's cases are good. I think you could also just analysis extend, even on the basis of we're done talking for 5 minutes, because I did time. Okay.
Almost.
Closing opposition. What do you guys got?
We didn't write much, and a lot of it got said by our opening, but I think that if I were to be right in the debate, I would do 2 things. So first of all, I would really expand on this factor thing, because what it immediately does is it explains why opening government's claim of misinformation is not that relevant in the debate. And it's for the simple reason that it's just extremely likely that if you're talking about a government that has large amounts of control over things like print media and shit like this, they're probably just going to make their own apps and police very heavily what does and doesn't go on there. So what that means is that the margin of the debate is not actually on misinformation. Then we probably run the same principle on freedom of speech, and we reuse that analysis to just explain that things like the print are really heavily controlled. Secondarily, that the idea of the internet is one that the government cannot claim authority on because it's like not native to them. They didn't make it, so it's illegitimate for them to control it. And then there's a number of there's an intuition about how like you wouldn't take the last scrap of like Grohl from Oliver Twist, which is why it's really bad. It's like inhibitive regime to further limit people's freedom of speech. And then there were like a couple of practical reasons why this is bad. I think that the first one was the influence of degrees, which our opening says. But I think that the second one is about the independent value that exists in non-professional people posting online. So this is like, if this is a bad experience with your doctor and you're a patient, you should be able to speak freely and openly about that. I think the second thing is I would try and systematize their critique from just one of racial homogeneity to things like your professors have specific buy-in to the regime. That means that when you speak on these issues, they are likely to feel like there's a degree to which you want to acquiesce to their beliefs on specific things. Then there's other things like the buy-in that other people who exist within that regime have, and the critiques that you are likely to face from, and for people like your family, because people who have these professional degrees are not going to decide and they want to be influencers, and so they're just uniquely controllable. This is probably what I would end up doing.
Nice. Cool. Fun motion prep. Thank you guys very much for participating. Which then also brings us fairly directly into the other ways that you can weigh things. Because you guys started to talk a little bit about some weighing metrics within your motion prep in terms of things like vulnerability and responsibility from opening opposition. But like the flaw of a motion prep is they can't really criticize their analysis, or you can if they miss a burden entirely. But like then you're vulnerable to Rodon going, but I didn't give the whole speech. I would have covered it. It's an obvious burden, etc. So what are the other things that you can weigh in a debate? And let's talk through these. I think there's 3 ways to do weighing on not impacts, but instead on analysis. I think you have resilience, certainty, and robustness. So resilience is the thing I was sort of talking about before in terms of like, this is how many different things can happen before your impacts stop happening. So how many... Resilience is supposed to be reliance on this page. That's why I'm confused. Because what I mean by resilience is I mean robustness. Okay, reliance. So starting with reliance, which is just the idea that in order to prove X impact, you need to do our analysis. Our analysis proves this impact because here's why this link missing means that you can never prove it at all. And here's why you're able to fill that burden. Reliance is like a thing that people are somewhat skeptical of more broadly. But I think that reliance is generally a fair way to weigh. You just probably shouldn't have it be your only weighing metric of your opening, unless it's something that's super clear, right? Like they've missed a critical burden that they're unable to prove their case in absence of, and you guys have filled that burden, and that's your entire case. Then reliance can be a way that you weigh, but I think that it probably should be a way you weigh along with other things. Then you have certainty, which is just our analysis is far more certain to happen than theirs is. And certainty is basically another way of saying analytical strength, right? It's another way of saying we are substantially more rigorous in the way that we've proven this, and therefore we have more links, we have more layers, we've gotten to the impact more clearly because we've spent more time on it. I think certainty is a way that people have a tendency to default across the bench in terms of like, we're more certain than opposition's impacts, but I think it's a very clear way to weigh your own analysis internally to the bench. And the last one is robustness, which is just like, even if opening opposition gives like 7 responses, our case still works because our case has layers upon layers of even if they say get this, then that. Robustness / resilience, which, I've written multiple times in this slide. And so I think that robustness is a way that judges will sometimes tie-break benches, but they feel really weird about doing this tie-break. It feels really strange to be like, because we're told that we're not supposed to play responses into comparisons, but technically robustness is analytical strength and analytical rigor. So it's really hard in a way for a judge to be like, well, it was like one liner of response that took down opening government and closing government didn't have these same vulnerabilities. That's a thing that puts them at risk of getting lower scores on feedback. So if you do the work for them, that's fine, because now it's been explained in the debate and it's analysis that they can pull, and they can be like, as government whip said, resilience and robustness is a way that I can adjudicate this debate. And it allows them to sort of shift the burden onto you a little bit. So if you think your greatest strength over your opening, or if you think your greatest strength on the bench is how not vulnerable you are to response, you definitely should be taking the time to flag it, because a judge might or might not do it for you. And even if they do it for you, they're going to feel weird about it, and they're going to take more time in DLive than they should. Yes?
How do you prove that instead of being like, try and respond to this, bro? Like, yeah.
this is why it works best whenever it's fairly clear, right? So to be clear, I did this weekend in that I broke a clash because closing government literally got flipped in a single line of response. And that is really bad. That's quite terrible. And opening government did not get flipped in a single line of response, nor did I think there was a single line of response that could flip them. And so my way of justifying this in the oral adjudication was I spent about a minute on explaining why I thought this was relevant and useful. So I think it works best when it's clear. But I also think that there are some ways you can do this from WHIP that are ever decreasing as the world's manual changes and becomes meaner to you about your ability to respond to your opening. So you can you're no longer allowed to say, if they gave this one response, then they would be dead. You're not allowed to say that anymore, which is depressing because resilience is a valuable way to adjudicate, and sometimes it's hard to explain what the response would have been. But you can usually target the reasons that it's so easily flippable or so easily respondable. So perhaps it's that their premise is questionably true. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but they never proved that their premise is true. So therefore, they're vulnerable to response, which would take down their entire case because their premise is the thing they're building the rest of their argument on. I think you can target the aspects that make them so vulnerable to response in absence of the direct response being given and make that claim on robustness. Okay, last thing then on handling top half. I think there's two ways that you can handle weighing in top half that are actually useful ways to handle top half, or actually two groups of ways. The first one is the 3 ways that you can do weighing in top half against other teams and just kind of hope. You can weigh in a vacuum. You can be like, we do a lot of scale and scale is good and valuable. I think this is evil. I think it is so hard to do, really difficult to figure out. And I think most of the time it honestly doesn't work because as we've seen with our little exercise going back and forth against all of these different comparisons, every single weighing metric can be put against another one and outweighed by it. You just need time to flip it, which back half always has time to flip it. So I think weighing in a vacuum is the more vulnerable way to handle top half. But if you don't have another thing to do, I think that's fair enough. The comparative and sneaky way to do it is weighing in a POI, where you do your little weighing metric thing, except you fit it into 15 seconds and use a POI. And instead of responding, which I think is oftentimes not useful in POIs, although it's the thing that people default to, they're like, you're wrong about that thing. Who cares? I don't understand why that's critical. I don't understand why that's valuable. But I have flipped comparison on POIs before, and the way that I flip comparisons in POIs is by giving weighing instead, because that's the line of analysis the judge was looking for. That's the rationale they are going to use in the oral adjudication or in the deliberation. I think that's easiest to get across in 15 seconds because honestly, a lot of weighing is not intensely complicated. It's just X thing versus Y thing. X things matters more. Here's why. And I think you can often squeeze this into 15 seconds. I would say these kinds of POIs probably should be written out so you don't lose the logical flow of them because it's too easy to get lost in your own speech. And should also probably, again, be compared with your partner because different intuitions on weighing. But I think that these POIs can be some of the most valuable ways to weigh from top half. The last thing then is illustration, because most of what weighing is just persuading a judge that something matters. Exactly like I said at the very beginning, weighing is what matters in a debate. And I think the easiest way, and actually the most intuitive way to persuade a judge that something matters, is to illustrate what these impacts look like. This is whenever you use rhetoric. This is whenever you lean really hard into the person aspect of it, as opposed to the numbers aspect of it. This is whenever you say things like, this is every single time you look in the mirror, this is how you feel about yourself. And this is whenever you say things like, this is every person who ever gets on a bus or whatever. I think that these kinds of illustrations are the most likely to be resilient way of weighing, because it may not be a technical metric way of weighing, but it is a thing that will stick in a judge's mind and will stick in their, like, I guess, hearts literally, because it will be a thing that's persuasive to them. And it's hard to overcome, like, just genuine persuasiveness. We're done.
Sometimes when I'm weighing illustratively, I also have some mechanisms,
God.
but they don't get credited. How do I make sure my weighing as illustration gets credited as weighing?
I genuinely think you would have a lot of your problems solved if you would speak slightly fewer words per minute. Because I think a lot of the problems with the illustrations folded into mechanisms you give is that it's not clear how any of these things relate or how they stretch out. I can explain this to you again tonight, later, slower. But for the moment, I would say I think that talking slowly and focusing on what you're doing and what the things that you're doing are supposed to mean is really important, as opposed to just maybe reading words off of the page. The last way to handle top half then is weighing the metric directly. So this is the thing I was talking about earlier in terms of principle. So I don't need to rehash it intensely, but I think that you can very easily from top half justify why this ought to be a utile debate or why this ought to be a non-utile debate. And this can cut out like half of the arguments in a round. So sometimes it can be really, really useful to do. I think that should be everything. Does anyone have any leftover questions on